thank you for suspending all the wonderful networking that's happening to come in and hear a little bit of storytelling. I am Josh Murphy. My nickname is Bones. I'm the director of the film that hopefully you'll all stay and see this evening that we made for Patagonia. And this is Molly Kawahata, who is the star of the film. And so we were asked to kind of give this talk now for all the right reasons, so we can kind of go a little bit deeper. But it's always awkward as a filmmaker to talk about a film you haven't yet seen. So I thought maybe we would just kind of first start with what this process is and how we got here. And then Molly and I are just going to riff here a little bit on kind of what the process of making film is. And quite honestly, making film with a person who, as she will expound upon, didn't really think a film should be made about her. And so there's a lot of really good story in that. I have been making film I went to UVM, used to live here for a very long time. Actually, fifth generation, I believe. My great-great-great-grandfather was governor way back when. I live on the left coast now, but this is still very much my home and my heart, and I love being back here. So when Alex asked, I said, absolutely, you bet. I directed a film a number of years ago called Artificial for Patagonia, which Yvonne Chenard had asked me to make for them at the time. And that was the second feature film that Patagonia had done. They've done a lot of short form. And before that, they made the wonderful film Damnation, which was their first feature film. And that started a relationship with them that led to this film. In the interim, I made a film for POW, Protect Our Winters, called Purple Mountains, which you may have seen, which was kind of a climate-based film. And then Patagonia called and said, we have an interest in talking about climate and climbing. And I remember thinking about it for a second and thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? And I was like, very clearly said, I don't want to be the guy that tells that story about, hey, because of climate change, we can't go climbing or skiing in the places we used to go. And they're like, yeah, no, we don't want that either. And so it began this kind of discussion of what could this film be? And then they said, we have a couple people, do you have a couple ideas for people? And I did. There was a climate scientist that I'd worked with before that's at UNH. And I said, maybe this person, maybe that person. And they said, well, listen to this podcast. It's about this woman, Molly Kawahata. And so Carolyn Gleich.
I didn't know this.
You didn't? This is how it happened. And Carolyn Gleich, who is a Patagonia athlete, who's a ski mountaineer, had met Molly, and Molly will give us a little more on this, at the White House, I believe, when Molly was an advisor for the Obama White House and on the climate team. And when Protect Our Winters were there, she and Caroline were talking because I think she was in a liaison. You're going to tell us a little more. And they found that they had a very common friend who was a mountaineer skier who died in an avalanche, who had been Molly's instructor the first time she started climbing. And that was Caroline's best friend.
Liz Daly.
Yep. And so Caroline offered Molly, who was at the White House at the time, I believe still, maybe he had left at that point, to come on her podcast and talk about the way Molly was advocating reframing of the climate issue. And I remember listening to this and saying, now this is really interesting. Here's how we're getting into this. This person who had an interest in climbing, but had this background in climate advocacy and really understanding how it works at the policy level. And then when I listened to the podcast, I learned this other part of Molly's story, which is that she is bipolar, and that struggle has kind of defined her life. And that became the very basic building blocks of our story, which was this person who was interested in climbing, was dedicated to climate and reframing it, but also had their own struggles. And that was the beginning of what is now the Scale of Hope, which we'll hopefully watch later. But I don't know how much you knew of that story.
Very little.
But tell us how you met Caroline and how the work that you were doing kind of brought you here, because it's a funny, circuitous path that we got here.
Yeah, I don't even know if I knew it was her podcast. But I didn't do any public speaking, like at all. I had been asked to do a few panels, and I always turned them down because I was like, I don't think I have anything to say. And Caroline was starting a podcast and was looking for guests, and I think I was like her first or second, and needed folks. And she asked me, and I said no. And I was like, I say dumb stuff all the time. So like a podcast that's like stuck for eternity. It's like, and anyway, she convinced me. And as I was kind of preparing, I mean, again, I didn't do any public speaking. I realized that while I didn't think I had anything to say, I ranted to friends all the time about what I felt were problems with the climate movement, the environmental movement, how we need to reframe. And I was like, oh, that's what people mean when they say they have something to say. So I basically was like, okay, well, if I do a podcast, I can just send people, rather than rant to them, I can just send them this, criticism of the carbon footprint, the origin story, the fact that we lead with fear, guilt, and shame instead of hope, a lot of things that were ineffective in climate. And so I did this podcast, and I guess this is the one, apparently, that the Patagonia head of films happened to hear. And I got a message on Instagram, and like I delete my Instagram all the time. So it was like in the, the request inbox, and I just missed it for like, I think like weeks or months. And then I saw it, and he was like, we want to make a film about climbing and climbing. And I rolled my eyes. I was just like, oh God. And I was scared that it was the film Josh described about, I need to fight climate change because I want to keep climbing. I need to fight climate change so I can keep skiing. There are people that really push that narrative. It's extremely problematic for probably pretty obvious reasons. Really concerns me. It's extremely out of touch. It's really not acknowledging the people who are most impacted by not just the effects of climate change, but the sources of the climate crisis, like our transportation and electricity systems, kind of the opposite of an environmental justice frame. So anyway, they get me on the phone, and I'm just kind of advising for free. I was just like, cool, you want to make a film? Great. All the climate films I've ever seen suck. Starting with, honestly, An Inconvenient Truth. Like, it's a film about a PowerPoint.
But you didn't watch that until like...
It's a film about a PowerPoint. And then like on it is like just everything wrong. It's like stock footage of like fire, wildfire, drought, graph going up, all caps words that are like fear, guilt, shame, go cry in the corner. And honestly, as much as we like to think that that's effective, psychology has debunked that. And we can talk more about that. But it's truly the opposite of getting people to act. It's demotivating. So when I talked to them, I was just like, cool, here are the problems with climate. Here's what we need to change. This is how you can use your storytelling strategy. And then just hung up and forgot about it for months. And then they called back, and I did another session with them. And then at the end, Alex was like, do you have any on-camera experience? And I was like, what? No. And I hung up and forgot about it for months. And then they called back, and Josh was on the phone. I didn't even understand what a production company was. I didn't understand any of this. I was like, who's Josh? Is he with Patagonia? Anyway, and Josh asked me questions like, what was it like when you left DC? And what was like growing up like? All these really personal questions, and I was like,
creeper.
Is this a film about me? And I found out it was, but no one had told me that.
This is true. This is totally true.
Literally, I remember that
totally
call
true.
just being like, and you just kept saying, you're an expert, and I was like, no, I'm not. But I like talking about this stuff. And it was a really quite a few conversations where I honestly remember on multiple occasions saying, I think you have the wrong person.
She did.
One, I suck at climbing. It's Patagonia. You make the best climbers in the world, like Kitty Calhoun. That's the people you make films about, not me. Number two, my life is really boring. I sit at a desk all day. I'm a behind-the-scenes person. This doesn't make sense. I don't know what you're going to film. And three, I just don't feel worthy in general. No one feels worthy. I still don't feel really worthy of a film being made about me. I still struggle with that. But I remember saying, I think you have the wrong person, and I'll help you find the right one. I remember saying, I get what you kind of want to do. I'm not the right person for this. And I honestly started brainstorming people. And ultimately,
You sent us a list.
Yeah, probably. I'm not surprised. Could have really lifted up some friends. And I just remember, eventually you guys really pushed that, no, you have a story to tell. And I didn't see it, but I trusted you guys. And eventually, basically, I said, I live with bipolar II disorder. It's a huge part of my story, thing one. Thing two is make the first climate mitigation film. I've never seen it.
Explain what mitigation versus adaptation.
So
I didn't know
adaptation.
this.
So there are two kind of areas of climate policy. They're many. Two of them are adaptation and resilience. So adaptation and resilience is dealing with the effects of climate change that are here and on the way. This is flood standards, dealing with climate-related natural disasters, dealing with FEMA response, all the things around, like Al Gore's film, right? Like all the scary stock footage you see. That's climate adaptation resilience. Very, very important part of policy. Not an effective narrative. Like my friends who work in that space are like, cool, let me do my job. Don't use our narrative. Mitigation is on the other side. That's what we worked on at the Obama White House with my colleagues. Mitigation is about cutting greenhouse gas emissions at the source, at the sector, like double-digit percentage cuts. That's what we're aiming for. When you look at the greenhouse gas emissions pie in the US of where emissions are coming from, you look at the sources and you're like, cool, what policies do we need to cut these? It's about solving the climate crisis, not treating it. And I had never seen a film that had that perspective. Now, mitigation is incredibly hopeful. It's incredibly inspiring because when you fight climate change, you improve the quality of life for pretty much everybody. And we can talk more about that. But that was that process of going through that. And I basically said, well, can you make a climate film that leads with hope? I've never seen one. And you guys said yes.
And I didn't know when you said that what you meant by hope. And it was funny because she said, I think I just watched Inconvenient Truth like last year. And she said it was really bad. And I was like, you just watched it then? She's like, yeah, I don't watch that kind of film that much, which I thought was even better. And I didn't understand where she was coming from with hope. And it took a long process to understand what Molly's view of hope is. And it really changed what my view is too, and realized how motivating hope can be. And I think that's something that at first, as a filmmaker, you look for drama. And drama is not always in hope. It's in conflict. And when you look at conflict all the time, you land in this adaptation frame, right?
Yeah.
Because you're saying, where's the conflict? Where's the other conflict? Let's see what they do when they get together. But on the hope side, you're actually saying, okay, we recognize conflict, but what do we learn from it that motivates us towards the positive instead of motivating us towards the negative? And I didn't quite get that right away.
Yeah, well, it's abstract, right? Like, I mean, you have incredible stock footage. I get why every documentary film I'd ever seen on climate was around adaptation resilience, because the stock footage is amazing, super visual with like fires and stuff. The stories are very delineated, like beginning, middle, and end of somebody's experience going through this. It's a very localized perspective. That was one of the other challenges. It's too localized in my view, because climate is really unique in its universality and how it affects everybody everywhere. The emissions go into the atmosphere. They're everybody's. The atmosphere doesn't care where your emissions come from, as they say. So there's a universality to this. And the problem with looking at super localized stories is that it kind of implies the opposite. Now, that doesn't mean those stories aren't valid or shouldn't be told. It was just that I had never seen a film that tried to do anything else. So that's what we set out to do. And I agreed to it pretty reluctantly. And I remember saying, my life is boring. And you were like, no, we'll figure it out. And then a few months in, you were like, your life's kind of boring. We don't know what to film. And I was like, I told you. So there was a huge process there too, being like, well, what do we put in this?
I think as I recall, I was like, what will we see you doing? She's like, nothing. I don't do anything. I'm like at a computer. I'm like, no, but I'm sure you do something. She's like, I'm on podcasts. You can't see podcasts. And I remember just saying, I think we're going to find something you're doing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we found in the film, which became a metaphor, but also a wonderful kind of vehicle, is Molly trying to reach what seemingly was an insurmountable goal. And she wanted to climb in the Alaska Range, which is one of the biggest playgrounds to climb in, shall we say. And she had set her sights on doing this, and she very self-admittedly didn't have the skills. And so we said, well, can we follow you as you try to get there? And she's like, I don't even know what that means, but sure. And she had moved to Montana. I don't know if you were
during
but where you were in?
I was in Mammoth Lakes.
You were in Mammoth. She was in Mammoth first, and then she was moving to Montana. She said, I want to really train in this one canyon to get really good at the skills I don't have. And so we said, okay, well let's watch some of that. So reluctantly, she agreed to have us come along, and us is a very small crew. It's myself, our producer, Laura Wagner, normally a cinematographer, sometimes a sound person, but I run sound because we like to keep it really, really tight because that allows us the flexibility to adapt and not overwhelm somebody like Molly who's like, I don't want to do this. So if you showed up with 10 people, she'd be like, I really don't want to do this. And it became like a very small core group, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, well, and the still photographer.
And then the still
crew. It's a crew.
Exactly.
Especially on an ice wall. There are quite a few people up there with you.
Well, when we went to Alaska, it was a couple more people, but still pretty small. I think we were 7 at the time. But it became a way of us asking Molly to allow us into her life and to observe parts. And I will say, honestly, it's hard. Like, I won't think I would want somebody following me with a camera and asking me the questions. And I think Molly did an amazing job at kind of challenging us as storytellers with the story we were telling. Not just about her, but about the things she was advocating for. I mean, we were just talking just a few minutes ago about how when she explained framing, I didn't really understand how framing worked. And she explained how I am kind of lifelong environmentalist, for lack of a better term. I studied wildlife fisheries biology here at School of Natural Resources, have a master's in natural resources and fisheries, and I looked at things through a certain prism. And Molly came at it very differently, and it took me a minute to get up to speed, but my learning hopefully then became learning that you all will have in the film. But maybe you can kind of explain this framing idea and what the limitations have been to date because of the way we think about things, about the power of the mind.
Yeah, so I can explain this, and some of you may have gotten this lesson from me before. So I'll do it really fast. We'll recreate an experiment to show what I'm talking about. It was a psychology study done in the 80s, but it's very well documented. So I'm going to give you a direction, then I'm going to ask you a question, okay? Okay. Here's the direction. Do not think about a pink bear. Raise your hand if you're thinking about a pink bear. Okay, yeah, exactly. So it seems so obvious, right? But what this is actually showing is that thought suppression is very difficult. It's called ironic rebound. When you tell somebody not to think about something, they are likelier to think about it, right? Like, you weren't thinking about a pink bear. It wasn't on your mind at all. All of a sudden, I created that thought in you. It's like, remember the last time you were anxious and somebody was like, just don't be anxious. Just don't think about that. And you're like, all I can do is think about that. I know that well as somebody living with bipolar II disorder. And so basically, this is not effective because basically when you try to negate an existing frame, you advance it. We do this all the time in climate because there are a lot of anti-climate narratives that we don't quite realize are anti-climate narratives. And we try to debunk them. And in the process, we just help them. So an example of this is like, if somebody's yelling, climate action hurts the economy. You hear this. This is an anti-climate narrative, but you don't think of it that way. You think, oh, it's just somebody kind of pushing back. It's anti-climate narrative because it's just factually incorrect. Climate action helps the economy in almost every way. However, if some guy is yelling that on a street corner, it's not effective for me to go stand next to him and yell, no, climate action does not hurt the economy, because I'm telling everyone not to think of a pink bear. I'm still wiring in your brain a connection between climate action and a herd economy, wired. And this is backed by neuroscience. So basically, when you have a thought in your brain, it actually is firing a web of neurons. And when you have that thought again, it's firing that web of neurons again, and that web grows stronger. If you've ever heard neurons that fire together, wire together. So what happens is that when I'm saying, don't think of a pink bear, don't think of a pink bear, don't think of a pink bear, you got a really strong pink bear neural pathway I've created in your brain. What we need to do is called reframing. This has largely been pioneered by cognitive linguist George Lakoff. He's at UC Berkeley for decades. Brilliant cognitive linguist. Basically, what you need to do is not even respond to them. You need to remove yourself entirely from what they're talking about and do what's called reframing. I'll give you an example of a very effective one in the public health sphere. So during the Obama years, when there was the whole healthcare debate, people were attacking Obama and they were saying Obamacare costs too much. And instead of saying, no, it does not cost too much, right, which would just be continuing to associate Obamacare with cost, he actually said healthcare is a human right. Why is that effective? Because there's no association with cost. You don't put a price on a human right ever. You fight for it at all costs. Same with climate. So we need to basically remove what we're thinking about, talking about anytime somebody's talking about pretty much any other frame and throw it into the public health domain. And you'll learn more about that in the film.
That's the fun I get as a filmmaker, to have her tell me that and go, damn it, I'm thinking about a pink bear. And then have her explain why my existing frame wasn't working. I think that's something that I took away from the film in the making of it, was that Molly kind of explained that, the environmental movement, which I've devoted so much of my life to, has really taken maybe I missay this, but I'm going to try my best, like consumer-centric. The onus is on the individual who's largely privileged, has more opportunity than most people, and buy your way out of this. Buy a Tesla, buy a home heating thing, buy a this, buy a that, buy a. And when you think about it, all of the frames that we have been served up are green your life by buying. Right? Now, there's something about consumer choice, but how does that expand the group of people that may not have the privilege to purchase as a way of making change? Because there's a huge group of people that are being impacted daily that can't use purchase power to advance a better climate and environment. And when she explained that to me, I was like, oh my God, I hadn't thought about it that way. And it took somebody explaining that this frame has to change, and that painting this as a public health frame where a mother working a few jobs is not told, fix this by buying this, but instead tell people that you want your children to be healthy, that air quality is important, that these changes has an impact on the future of their families, and you're going to vote to make sure that if you don't stand up for that, you're not going to be in office. That person has agency without spending a dime. Yeah. They're advocating. And I think that's something I learned, that, wow, I think I was going about this kind of wrong.
Yeah, and so kind of what we're getting at here is that public health is where climate change becomes climate justice. You've kind of heard the term, people throw around the term climate justice a lot, but it means something very specific. So communities of color are significantly likelier to have to live near things like fossil fuel power plants, polluting highways, toxic waste sites, refineries. That has huge public health impacts. They have some of the highest asthma rates in the country, increased hospitalization rates, cancer, heart disease, lung disease, miscarriage. The list goes on, and communities of color are the ones who are bearing the brunt of this. Now, what happens? It's about pollution. Climate change is just pollution, and pollution is climate change. And pollution is climate change is fundamentally a public health issue. I could say this for like days. When people talk about environmental justice, they need to be talking about public health. So at the end of the day, if you ride your bike to work, if you use a plastic straw, at the end of the day, like, you have to think about, are you solving a problem for everybody? No, not at all. And by the way, the individual carbon footprint is fossil fuel propaganda. It was popularized by British Petroleum, BP oil spill, those people, in a huge marketing campaign that basically got the environmental movement to adopt it and hugely pushed this idea of greening your life. Now, greening your life is great. Anybody who wants to do it has the privilege of doing it. I commend you. Go for it. At the end of the day, though, we need to solve climate change for everybody, and we can only do that through systemic change.
Once again, that's my brain going. But I think that's what in the film you get to see in action. And so even though Molly said, I don't have anything to say, you don't need to follow me doing anything, I think you'll see very quickly that that's not the case. And I think maybe that's something we can talk about, is like, what was it like for you to go through the process of a film being made about you talking about these three like legs of our story?
Yeah.
What was it like?
Well, to be honest, like, I really was like, timid. I mean, yeah, I really wasn't one of those people who like really felt like I was worthy of having a spot where people would hear me. Like I would talk like this. And so it's really outlandish for like a film crew to come and say, we want to tell your story. And it's hard. It's very hard to be followed around by cameras for like a year and a half. It's extremely hard to learn to do something new on camera, like ice climb. Very embarrassing. Like you'll see a lot of embarrassing moments, and just being like, is that going in? Is that going in? And you have to really trust somebody to tell your story because you're giving it up, and it's your story, and it's going into the hands of other people, and you really don't have much control over that, and so it's horrifying. But I do feel that like there are like always going to be limitations in how well like a story can transfer over to somebody else. But overall, you guys really did tell it in a way that was authentic and true to me. And one of those things was they were like, "Who are you?" And I was like, "I'm somebody who lives with bipolar 2 disorder. It is a huge part of my life." Some people stray away from that, and they don't have to associate much of it with their identity. For me personally, it is because it's something I'm proud of. I'm really proud of it. It makes me who I am, and I think it's the source of all my suffering and the fuel of all of my accomplishments. So for me personally, when I looked back, I actually, it wasn't an act of rebellion to be like, society tells me I should feel shame and I'm proud. It really wasn't that. It was just for all the amazing things in my life, I felt I had bipolar 2 disorder to thank. So when we talked about that, they said, okay, we'll tell that story. And it's not an easy story to tell, but there are definitely scenes in the film where I look back and I'm like, I was kind of hypomanic. I was like pretty high energy there. I had no idea. Like depression's much easier to spot. So it is interesting to see these huge energy fluctuations and how that kind of affects the people around me, because that's just part of what it's like living with this illness.
I co-founded our production company called Liars and Thieves with my creative partner, Colin Kreiner, who is the editor of this film and the editor of Artificial and the editor of Purple Mountains and the editor of so many things. We have a very kind of tight relationship, but the name Liars and Thieves was kind of a joke because our opinion is that creativity begins with trust. Unless you are just making your own thing, and you don't have to trust anybody else, and you just make it and you don't care. But very few people do that. They make things and they share it with friends, and you trust that your friends are going to give you good advice and say, you kind of missed the mark, right? Or, yeah, that's working. And I think that that's a really, really important point for me, which I said to Molly, like, this is a film about you, not by you, and I really honor you for trusting us to tell the story, but it's really, between storyteller and subject, there becomes a very fraught relationship, but I think we've navigated pretty well because there are times where things are a little off kilter that Molly's like, I don't want to see that of myself. And I was like, great. But we always ask permission. And there's times that you'll see some difficult scenes in the film. And we said, we're not going to show this. We're not even going to roll the camera unless you're okay with this.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that as a storyteller, I wanted to share with everybody is that there's a permission that must be granted, but there's also a level to which you don't want to give full permission because then they self-editorialize and you take away the authorship. And so that's one of the things we try to find out.
I was not a producer in the film. Right. Like if Taylor Swift's documentary, I think she was a producer in it. Yeah. You tell a very different story. Like I wasn't allowed to be. and that is something interesting. Like there's a scene you'll see where I'm laying on the bed. I can't really move. I'm so depressed. And Josh and the cinematographer, they were just getting their cameras ready. It takes hours to get these like robot fancy ass cameras that they use ready. And so they were getting them ready and I just was on the bed, not moving. And at one point they kind of realized something's happening here and asked me permission, which I really appreciated. If they could start rolling. And I said, well, this is bipolar 2 disorder. There's never a full victory. It's a lifelong, incurable mental illness that I live with. I'm glad it's kind of lifelong. I wouldn't give it up if I could today with treatment. Without treatment, in a second. With treatment, I wouldn't give it up. But with that said, it was like, this is the story. And if you didn't show this, it would kind of be a lie. And I really didn't want to like pretend partially because I don't want to be held accountable for it. Pretend I like know everything and like I'm like the super together person, because it would just be dishonest. And I think honestly, we all struggle, no matter how together you are. Like we all know what it's like to struggle. We all know what it's like to suffer. And you don't have to be diagnosed with a mental illness to understand that. And one of the ways I was hoping you guys would tell that story was in a way that was fairly general, so that people could really just use my story to see theirs. At the end of the day, like, I don't really care if people like know who I am. If it, though, makes people reflect on their own life story, on their own suffering, on their own dreams and accomplishments and who they are, that's why I did it, right? And so I can only hope that that's what people can get out of it. But I know that's kind of what you guys went for when we went through that process. It's about everybody, you know? Nothing's about any one person. You do sometimes see films that are really just about one person, and they're like, ugh, you know? Or like that social media person you like follow on Instagram that like it really just is about them, and you're just like, ugh.
I saw this one about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ugh. Just kidding. Love that film. We are going to take a couple Q&As right now, but it's weird, again, to have Q&As before the film, if you've seen, but we're going to make more time for that after. But if there's any more general questions about what we've covered here, we'd love to kind of just chat about it, and then certainly we'll reconvene after the film when you've seen it, and I think you can dive a little bit more deeper and ask some more telling questions. But does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much, first of all. And we hear about all these things that taught from you. What is something that you learned?
Yeah, I mean, it might sound kind of cliche, but it was like, honestly, like your wildest dreams are within reach and sooner than you think. That kind of blew my mind. I thought climbing the Alaska range was like, I'd seen photos of it. I'd gone to Alaska a couple times at different ranges, and they were never the Alaska range. You know, it never looks like you think it'll look. And I just knew I didn't have the skill. I sucked at ice climbing. I mean, it was like, I just didn't have the experience. And I thought I was like 10, 15 years away from maybe climbing something there. And then I like realized, oh, you can just try and, you know, work your life around a place where I had the privilege of being able to ice climb a lot, and relocate to where I did. And it just opened up my dreams for me, but like within a year. And I moved there separately from the film. Like I was already on that track, but it was wild to kind of be followed on that journey of being like, I didn't think it would be possible for me to ever lead ice. Like when I showed up in Highlight, my partner took me up a WI4, pretty moderate, like 4-pitch climb. And I like kept hanging. I was like falling all the time, hanging on top rope, like as following him. And at one point, he was like, she's struggling so hard. He had to like find an alternate route. This is not considered a hard climb. And to go from that, I remember telling him, I was in awe that he could climb that, in awe. And I remember telling him, I'll never lead ice, and that's okay. It's sure fun to follow. And that was just the trajectory I'd made for myself. I'd accepted that. So to then go through this process where it was quite casual to be leading ice, and to lead that same route, and then to be in Alaska by May was mind-blowing. And so it just made me realize that the limits we put on ourselves and the rules of the game, you can change really fast. And that's kind of an incredibly liberating concept.
Funny story, too. We were just talking to her about how can we follow you do something, and all of a sudden we realize she's moving from Mammoth Lakes to Montana because she wants to climb in this one canyon and never told us. And I was like, we could follow you in the move. We could do this. She's like, oh, sorry about that.
I already left. I'd already moved. It was like overnight, yeah.
This is when we were still figuring out how we were going to do this. Like these points in life where you turn and make changes are wonderful for storytelling. And she's like, oh, yeah, you don't need to see that.
Yeah, no, I like did it. You kind of like learn to like hide from your camera crew. And I like that was one of them where I was just like, oh no, I'm already here. Sorry, missed it. My bad. Because I just didn't want that recorded. I don't know.
Can you talk a little bit about the training that you went through? And then I imagine it's just requires so much like physical and mental
Yeah.
strength, like how you were at the very beginning, and then the climbing that you kind of came into.
Yeah, I mean, I went from like sucking at ice climbing to like being kind of mediocre at it. But it was enough to get me up. I mean, it was a pretty intense training regimen, several hours of like cardio and working on muscular endurance in a gym. But more than that, spending every waking moment that I was working full time in Highlight Canyon, and was so blessed and lucky to be taken in by ice climbers there who were willing to work with me, who sucked at ice climbing and basically made me into an ice climber and empowered me in my dreams that I honestly didn't think were possible. So it was quite a bit of time. I mean, like going out, leaving 6 a.m., coming back at dark every day that I could be out there. And after work even, and before work in the mornings, just like trying to just get as much mileage on steep water ice as I could.
And when we started following her, when she wasn't running away from us, she had lots of tape on her arms, which you see in the film, because she had tendonitis basically from climbing a lot and still figuring out the movement, and her body was kind of beat up because she was doing it so much. But that's what allowed her to do what you get to see in the film too.
Yeah, at the time I didn't think it was a huge jump to like go to Alaska, because I'd done years and years of mountaineering, which is like non-technical mountain climbing, like
walking up a mountain,
walking up on glaciers, really. And ice climbing, this is like full arms and feet, and you have technical ice tools instead of like straight axes that you kind of use as like a walking stick instead. You're really using the tools. Totally different form, but I kind of thought it was all sort of related. It wasn't. And so I look back and I'm kind of like, the jump really was essentially, I went into the Alaska range my first real year of ice climbing, which in retrospect was kind of insane, but at the time felt like the next logical step. It probably wasn't.
You had a question?
Yeah. I'm curious how it was being on camera all the time.
Super weird.
Like, were you able to be authentic? Were you able to tune them out? How was that?
Super weird. I think I was able to be authentic. I did this weird thing where
You kept asking for hair and makeup though, really, right? Just kidding. She didn't do that. She really didn't do that.
I don't think I wore any makeup.
No, you didn't.
I probably should have.
Not at all.
I mean, it's weird. I don't even know how to describe it. Like, I just kind of go about my day, and then there, like, a camera shows up, and you're just like, okay. But I had this weird thing where, like, when you guys would start rolling, I would just like go like this, like. It was so weird, and like poor Colin, the editor, had to like deal with so many takes. As soon as the camera goes on, I'd like do that, but I started to get used to it, and you just kind of, do your best to be as authentic as possible. I do think I was able to do that. I don't think at any point I felt like I was being performative or acting or trying to come off better than I was, because I don't think I could have if I tried. And I really didn't want to be telling a story that wasn't true, because that doesn't help people. Right? And like that was why Patagonia wanted to make a film about a mediocre ice climber, their first film about a mediocre climber, or probably athlete in any way, because people can relate to that. And I think there are two ways to tell your story, right? You can drive disconnection. That's one. You see this on Instagram, right? That's like the professional athletes. Like they're so elite and so amazing at what they do that it is driving disconnection. That's the objective. And you feel this awe, and it's incredible. There's also the like kind of annoying driving of disconnection of people who are just like, I live this aspirational lifestyle, fuck you, But at the same time, there's another way to tell your story, which is driving connection. And that's what I cared about, because the more vulnerable you are and the more honest you are and the more you suffer and show people that, I think the more people feel something and can relate to it. And again, reflect on their own life, which was my purpose, my sole purpose in doing this. So that was the idea.
And we had kind of fun backstory. We had Mikey Schaefer, who did all the high-angle cinematography for Free Solo, did all of our high-angle work. And Mikey is kind of I like to call him a really good Boy Scout, because not only was he there working the camera, but anytime Molly got in a tricky situation, which you don't hear in the film, is he could actually say, you're going to be okay.
Yeah. Like,
we're right here. Like when she was training, there was still the opportunity, because of the proximity of the camera, to get support. And so we tried to create a safe space for Molly to do what she needed to do when she still felt like she was hanging it out there a little bit. And the main cinematographer in the film, August Thurmer, his sister struggled with and ultimately succumbed to mental illness not that long ago. And he grew up with that. And when he and Molly started talking about it, it created a space where Molly could really open up. And I think that's one of the things that we try to do with film is find the right people to work together on a film. Because I remember you were like, I can't believe you're just so easy, August. And there was just a little,
it's easy to talk to him, yeah.
It was a really nice wavelength that I think was created, you know?
Well, and I honestly, I've always been really casual about living with bipolar 2 disorder. Like, I tell strangers in passing, and you could kind of see the shock on their face, but like, there was something about kind of normalizing it so casually that I felt like was, I don't know, doing something. And so with August, I could just kind of continue that cadence very easily. I owe Mikey Schaefer everything for the type of cinematographer he was for me and just the type of friend and support system. Oh, that guy everything, because there is a scene in there where I truly panic, and he was right there to help me out super calmly, like it was no big deal. And now this situation you'll see happens to me all the time, and it's like no big deal. Like, I just deal with it. It's equipment failure, you'll see. But he was just right there to just be like, you're okay and you're safe and it's gonna be fine. Even though I kind of wasn't like super safe. Like, you know, an equipment failure when you're leaning on ice above your last piece, like things can happen, but just knowing everything would be okay if you just tell yourself it will be. It's kind of a mental trick, yeah.
Can you elaborate on how you would shift the messaging? Completely agree with the reframing. If you could change the messaging around,
Yeah.
how would you shift it? How would you?
Yeah. So, sure. Okay. So I'm trying to decide how in detail we should go. I'll try to give a quick.
No spoilers.
Yeah, I'll give a quick overview, which is that. Raise your hand if any of you guys have ever had like a sudden realization that you didn't expect. Everyone. So mine came in like 2015, where I was sitting at a desk at the White House, and it hit me that we could try to do everything we could in the policy space, but we would always be limited if we didn't have overwhelming support from the American people and the electeds who represented them. So my theory of change, it started to evolve because we can't solve the climate crisis without systemic change, which is what I'm saying, not the carbon footprint, systemic change. And we can't get systemic change without policy and government action. And you can't get that until you get the people on board. And here was the realization, you can't get them on board until they feel something. And that last part, that people need to feel something, is key. So I started looking into the research because there's this whole field called psychology that studies how the brain and body work together. And one thing is very clear. Fear, guilt, and shame is antithetical to motivation. And we want to motivate people on climate, right? It actually makes you physically retract, your body takes up less space, and you freeze. You have you're paralyzed. It's called a trauma response. So we've been making people over the last 2 decades feel fear, guilt, and shame, and then asking why they're not acting. Any psychologist who knows this research could have told you you're inducing inaction. Al Gore. So at the end of the day, there was also something really interesting in the literature, which is that hope was powerful. And the whole idea was that in my work in the mitigation space that I was doing with my colleagues in solving the source of the climate crisis, there was an endpoint, a promised land. It's the zero carbon economy. And the best part is that we are well on our way, right? We are rapidly decarbonizing the electricity sector and electrifying other sectors. And in doing so, we're doing all of these really amazing things for society, like cleaning up the air for communities of color who currently can't breathe and are bearing these public health impacts, putting people back to work, creating jobs, investing in communities that haven't seen a ton of economic development, unleashing incredible technological innovation. I mean, we can go on. This is amazing. And there's this endpoint. So when you realize there's this promised land and that we're working toward it, hope is powerful. Hope is feasible. Hope is there. And that's how we lead on climate, because that's how you get people to act. Hope motivates people. It's not just something that feels good, it's effective. And that's where I said we need to start reframing. You'll learn more about how we talk about that in the film.
So all of you have been given a little window into the Q&A. You may hear some of these things after for people who haven't been here, but I would encourage you to stay after the film, learn more, hopefully stay for the film for that matter after dinner. And again, thank you for having us here. Thank you, Molly, for sharing your story, and can't wait to share with you. I think this is the fourth audience?
I think 5th or 7th.
So it's just begun, and it releases in, I believe, the 23rd of September.
I'm not sure,
And
actually.
if anybody was monitoring their phones today,
Big announcement.
big announcement.
Patagonia.
Patagonia just gave away the entire company. The Chenard family no longer own Patagonia, and they've donated all of the profits moving forever forward to nonprofits and climate and land-based solutions. It's pretty huge. Pretty amazing. So we look forward to sharing this film with a lot of other people too. So again, hopefully we'll see you afterwards. Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
all so much. You're so gracious.
Thank you.